will hear part of a tutorial between two students and their tutor. The students are doing a research project on computer use. Listen to the conversation carefully and answer questions 1 through 5. First, you have some time to look at the questions. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 through 5.
Dr. Barrett?
Sammy, come in. Is Irene with you?
Yes.
Good. Sit down. Right. We're looking at how far you've got with your research project since we last met. You decided to do a survey about computer facilities at the university, didn't you?
That's right. We decided to investigate the university's open access to a computer when they need one, so we thought it would be a useful area to research.
Good. It's not a topic anyone has looked at before, as far as I know, so it's a good choice. So what background reading did you do?
Well, we looked in the catalogs in the library, but we couldn't find much that was useful. It's such a specialized subject. Hardly anything seems to have been published about it.
And as well as that, the technology is all changing so quickly.
But the Open Access Center has an online questionnaire on computer use that it asks all the students to do at the end of their first year, and the supervisor gave us access to that data. So we used it as a starting point for our research. It wasn't exactly what we needed, but it gave us an idea of what we wanted to find out in our survey. Then we designed our own questionnaire.
And how did you use it?
We approached students individually and went through our questionnaire with them on a one-to-one basis.
So you actually asked them the questions?
That's right. We made notes of the answers as we went along, and actually we found we got a bit of extra information that way as well, about the underlying attitudes of the people we were interviewing by observing the body language and things like that.
How big was your sample?
Well, altogether we interviewed a random sample of 65 students, 55% male and 45% female.
And what about the locations and times of the survey?
We went to the 5 open access computer centers at the university, and we got about equal amounts of data at each one. It took us 3 weeks. We did it during the week, in the day and in the evenings.
Not the weekends?
No.
So presumably your respondents were mostly full-time students.
Yes. Oh, you mean we should have collected some data at the weekends from the part-time students? We didn't think of that.
Okay. It's just an example of how difficult it is to get a truly random sample. So how far have you got with the analysis of results?
Well, everyone agrees there was a problem, but we're more interested in what they think should be done about it. The most popular suggestion was for some sort of booking system. About 77% of the students thought that would be best. But there were other suggestions. For example, about 65% of people thought it would help if the opening hours were longer, like 24 hours a day.
Choice 1. Listen to the following talk and choose the correct answer for each question.
The Atlantic Ocean, named for the legendary lost island of Atlantis, has made up for the romantic origin of its name by becoming the most important commercial highway in the world, yet traces of romance continually mingle with the business of the sea. For instance, the Spanish adventurers who first sought gold and silver in America frequently found their ships becalmed, usually on the edge of the steady trade winds, about 30 degrees north or south latitude. A sailing ship could carry only so much water, and as it lay motionless under a hot sun for days or weeks, The tortures of thirst were agonizing. The horses were generally the first victims. They had to be thrown overboard when they died or became crazed with thirst. Because the Spanish caballeros thought highly of their horses, even crediting them with souls, they suffered great remorse and believed the ghosts of the proud war horses were haunting the scene. They saw the restless spirits in their dreams and related their dreams to sailors. Whenever the mariners passed that way, they would see in the spray or clouds images of wild horses bearing down on them. They began to call the broad belts of calm the horse latitudes, the romantic name by which they are known today.
Now turn to Section 2. Section 2. You'll hear a guide talking to visitors about a tourist attraction. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 14. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 14. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Roman Baths. My name's Amanda, and I'm your guide for today. Before we begin the tour, I'd like to point out that we have child carriers, free of charge, of course, for those of you with young children, and I can see that there are 1 or 2 of you here this morning. It might make things a bit easier for you than using a pushchair. If you don't want to carry your coats and bags around with you, there is a cloakroom behind reception where they'll be quite safe. Also, should anyone want to use the bathroom, there's one here in the reception hall, opposite the ticket office, and another one by the shop where we end our tour, right by the exit. Having mentioned the shop, I should tell you that it's full of interesting things for you to remember your visit by. Posters, postcards, replicas of the Gorgon's head, the Haruspex stone, and the statues that you'll be seeing on your tour. There are also games, books and videos for children and other souvenirs. Our first stop will be the terrace, where you will get your first view of the baths. Now, the statues that line the terrace here are of Roman emperors, governors of Britain, and various military leaders. These aren't from Roman times either. In fact, they were sculpted in 1894, especially for the grand opening of the baths in 1897. But what you can see from here is only a fraction of the whole Roman bath site, which stretches below ground level under the surrounding streets and squares of the town. While we're here on the terrace, getting our first look at the baths, let me fill you in on a bit of the history. This site, with its hot springs, has long been seen as a sacred place, and the first people to build here were the Celts, and the shrine they built was dedicated to the goddess Sulis. Of course, back in those days, they had no way of explaining how hot water came to be bubbling out of the ground, so they believed it to be the work of the gods. When the Romans came, they too built a temple here and dedicated it to their goddess, Minerva. Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 15 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 15 to 20. The bath you can see from here is called the Great Bath. Not very imaginative, I know, but it is the biggest. Impressive, isn't it? At one time it was housed in a huge vaulted hall 40 metres high, which for many people of the period must have been the largest building they'd ever seen in their lives. The bath itself is 1.6 metres deep, ideal for bathing, and has steps leading down to the water on all sides. The niches or alcoves you can see all around the bath would have had benches and possibly small tables for drinks and snacks. Not a bad way to spend your free time, relax, and tell yourself it's all good for your health. Let's move on to our next stop, the Sacred Spring. This is the heart of the site, where the hot water bubbles up from the ground at a temperature of 46 degrees centigrade. The water comes up from a depth of between roughly 2,500 and 4,500 metres, where geothermal energy raises the water temperature to between 64 degrees and 96 degrees. Over 1 million litres of this hot water rise up here every day, and as well as being hot, the water is rich in minerals, and it was thought it would cure various ailments and illnesses. In fact, people came here from all over the Roman Empire to try out its healing powers. Before we take a look at the changing rooms and saunas, which are known as the East Baths, and the plunge pools and heated rooms of the west part of the bathhouse, we'll pass through the site of the temple and the temple courtyard. Here we are. This temple is one of only 2 known classical Roman temples in Britain. The other is the Temple of Claudius at Colchester. This temple is said to date from the late 1st century AD, being built between 60 and 70 AD. But the original temple has been knocked about and added to over the centuries, and what you can see here are just bits of the original temple. Okay, shall we move on? That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
To section 3. Section 3. You're going to hear an explanation of how a school chancellor will be chosen. The chairman is explaining the process to 2 students, Sarah and Arnold. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25. Good evening, everyone. I hope you've both taken a look at the documents given to you. As student members of the University Chancellor Selection Committee, you will help to select a new Chancellor for our university. This person will be responsible for the operations, academics, and budget of the university. Today, I want us to talk about getting feedback from other students and about the selection process.
Okay, so what exactly will our roles be?
You both are 4 members of the committee representing the interests of the student body. When we go over the applicants for Chancellor, your votes will count the same as other committee members.
The same as other faculty and administrators? Okay.
Indeed. It is important to have student input in the selection process. That will be part of your duties as committee members, to talk to the student body and get a feeling for what they want in a new Chancellor. You will report back to me, the committee chairman, and then talk to the rest of the committee. I suggest that you contact the student newspaper and ask them to do some sort of survey. You both can also talk to the heads of various student organizations and gauge their opinions.
All right, what sort of questions should we ask?
Well, if you know of any issues important to the student body as a whole, you can ask them about that. I know that there was a recent increase in student fees. Since the Chancellor is in charge of the budget process, he or she will certainly be involved with that. But that is one topic that everyone can be asked about.
A question about financial issues? Okay. You also mentioned going to different student groups. I was wondering, would that be appropriate? If the Chancellor is the head of the whole university, is it that important to ask the opinions of a smaller individual organization?
Definitely. They may be smaller organizations, but they often represent a wide number of students. It would be in the best interests of the school to have a Chancellor that understands the needs of not just the community as a whole, but of the different parts that make up that whole.
I see. I guess it would be best to contact the leadership group of each club and group?
Yes, actually that would probably be the most efficient way to get their opinion. Before you hear the rest of the explanation, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30. After you get a feel for what the student body thinks, I would like you to create a report for me. As chairman, I am responsible for making sure the different views of the students, faculty, and the administration are heard.
So what happens after we submit our report to the rest of the committee?
We'll start with the rest of the selection procedures. We have an open process, meaning anyone who wants to can apply to be Chancellor. That way, we will have the widest available pool to choose from. Of course, the first step will be to narrow down the field of applicants. Looking at their background and work experience, we will end up with 15 candidates. There will be further background checks on the remaining candidates. These checks include talking to the references a candidate has listed, as well as asking about them at any previous institution they may have worked at.
This is quite a rigorous process, isn't it?
It has to be. The Chancellor represents the university, so we need the best qualified person. After the background checks, we will contact candidates and ask them to come in for an interview before the committee.
I remember hearing that we'll also be sitting in on those interviews. It'll be difficult to think of good questions to ask all those candidates.
Well, I think the committee as a whole will do that.
Okay. That sounds like the best way.
Yes, it's quite a rigorous interview process. Each candidate will have to come in a second time. The final 5 candidates will then be asked to come in a third time and actually interact with some of the community members here. After the committee chooses the finalist, that one name will be sent to the Board of Trustees to be approved. They will also go over the candidate's material before having an up or down vote on him or her.
Then that person becomes the Chancellor of the university? It is good to have so many people working together on this. I'm sure we'll find a great Chancellor.
Yes, actually there are many interesting stories about past selection committees. That is the end of Section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turn to Section 4. Section 4. You'll hear a talk on the subject of the urban landscape. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I have been asked today to talk to you about the urban landscape. There are two major areas that I will focus on in my talk: how vegetation can have a significant effect on urban climate, and how we can better plan our cities using trees to provide a more comfortable environment for us to live in. Trees can have a significant impact on our cities. They can make a city as a whole a bit less windy, or a bit more windy if that's what you want. They can make it a bit cooler if it's a hot summer day in an Australian city, or they can make it a bit more humid if it's a dry inland city. On the local scale, that is in particular areas within the city, trees can make the local area more shady, cooler, more humid and much less windy. In fact, trees, and planting of various kinds, can be used to make city streets actually less dangerous in particular areas. How do trees do all that, you ask? Well, the main difference between a tree and a building is a tree has got an internal mechanism to keep the temperature regulated. It evaporates water through its leaves, and that means that the temperature of the leaves is never very far from our own body temperature. The temperature of a building surface on a hot sunny day can easily be 20 degrees more than our temperature. Trees, on the other hand, remain cooler than buildings because they sweat. This means that they can humidify the air and cool it, a property which can be exploited to improve the local climate. Trees can also help break the force of winds. The reason that high buildings make it windier at ground level is that as the wind goes higher and higher, it goes faster and faster. When the wind hits the building, it has to go somewhere. Some of it goes over the top, and some goes around the sides of the building, forcing those high-level winds down to ground level. That doesn't happen when you have trees. Trees filter the wind and considerably reduce it, preventing those very large, strong gusts that you so often find around tall buildings. Another problem in built-up areas is that traffic noise is intensified by tall buildings. By planting a belt of trees at the side of the road, you can make things a little quieter, but much of the vehicle noise still goes through the trees. Trees can also help reduce the amount of noise in the surroundings, although the effect is not as large as people like to think. Low-frequency noise in particular just goes through the trees as though they aren't there. Although trees can significantly improve the local climate, they do, however, take up a lot of space. There are root systems to consider, and branches blocking windows and so on. It may therefore be difficult to fit trees into the local landscape. There is not a great deal you can do if you have what we call a street canyon, a whole set of high-rises enclosed in a narrow street. Trees need water to grow. They also need some sunlight to grow, and you need room to put them. If you have the chance of knocking buildings down and replacing them, then suddenly you can start looking at different ways to design the streets and to introduce.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.